President Sadat is dead. He was murdered this afternoon by a group of his own troops while reviewing a military parade in Cairo, and his death now puts into question the whole future of the Middle East. There's no single individual whose death will cause more damage to Western interests than that of Anwar Sadat. He died in hospital this afternoon, the victim of an attack by a small group of his own soldiers as he was taking the salute at Egypt's annual military parade. Obviously, there's great confusion in Cairo tonight, but an hour ago, the first satellite pictures came through, and indeed, they've been shown throughout the United States. It was then that we saw the full horror of what happened at that parade, and along with it, a report from our correspondent, Bob Jobbins, who watched and heard it all.
President Sadat, resplendent in a new gold-trimmed uniform as Field Marshal of the Egyptian Armed Forces, had taken the salute, laid a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier, and was reviewing an impressive display of Egyptian military might. Then, as the parade was reaching its climax, with most people's attention distracted by an aerobatic display,
A state of emergency has been announced for a year. But who will the real ruler be? President Sadat's sudden shifts of policy and the whole idea of sticking to the Camp David agreement in spite of everything made him fall out with large numbers of his senior ministers and officials. The only top figure who's survived the sackings is the Vice President, Hosni Mubarak. He remains in charge of the armed forces, and although it was soldiers who murdered Sadat, it looks as though the army as a whole may have stayed loyal. But if Mr. Mubarak does take over, it's hard to imagine that he'll just carry on where Sadat left off in Egypt's relationship with Israel. And Israel's view of the relationship is, of course, profoundly affected too. The first words tonight from Prime Minister Begin carried some cause for hope. He pledged that the Israeli-Egyptian peace process would continue. I'm sure, he said, that President Sadat would have wanted it so. The president's death had deprived the Israeli people of a friend and a partner in peace. There was outright rejoicing in Colonel Gaddafi's Libya, where President Sadat was regarded as a traitor to the Arab cause. Tripoli Radio, one of the first stations to broadcast Sadat's death, said every tyrant has an end. And there was rejoicing in London by the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
We were expecting this end of Mr. Sadat, or President Sadat, because we are sure that he was against the interests of his people, and against the interests of the Arab nation, and against the interests of the Palestinian people.
But wasn't he a friend of the PLO? He had been asking President Reagan only recently to bring the PLO into negotiations.
No, he hasn't been a friend of the PLO at all. He has been in a conspiracy against the PLO and the Palestinian people with the United States and the Israelis.
But at the Egyptian embassy, people called throughout the afternoon to find out about President Sadat. Their reaction was one of sorrow, though at that stage officials wouldn't confirm that the president was dead. The embassy should have held a reception tonight.
Reception cancelled? Ah.
People had to be turned away as the Egyptian embassy closed its doors. The first Foreign Office reaction in London came tonight from the Minister of State, Mr. Douglas Hurd. Christopher Wayne asked him for his own assessment of the president.
Well, I think he was a wise, brave man who had a style of leadership which was unique. He didn't wake up in the morning asking every day what other people thought of him. And I think that showed, and I think the world is a more dangerous place because he's gone.
How important was his personal touch in the Middle East peace process?
Well, it was very important, and indeed without that personal touch there would not be peace between Israel and Egypt today.
Can the Camp David peace process then survive without him?
Well, I think it was going to go through a stage of change anyway. When he was here in London in August, we talked about all that with him, and he was clearly wanting to move it on to a new stage. And so, of course, we Europeans have our own ideas about that. So I think in any case, it would have developed, and I'm sure under the new president it will.
Douglas Hurd of the Foreign Office. The news found half the world asleep, notably the heads of government at the Commonwealth Conference in Melbourne. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, was already asleep when the news broke, and his staff said they wouldn't be waking him. The Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, was awakened, and she's expected to issue a statement in the morning. The Queen, who's in Australia, and the Prince and Princess of Wales have sent personal messages of condolence. President Sadat was America's main ally in the Arab world, and the news of his death is bound to have a significant effect on American policy in the Middle East. Clive Small assesses the reaction in Washington.
This capital's in a state of shock following the news of President Sadat's death. Mr. Reagan sees the situation as grave.
Anwar Sadat was admired and loved by the people of America. His death today, an act of infamy, cowardly infamy, fills us with horror. America has lost a close friend, the world has lost a great statesman, and mankind has lost a champion of peace.
The American efforts in the peace process have been dealt what could be a crippling blow. The key figure in that process has been removed from the scene. The White House is still weighing up all the implications of what's happened in Cairo, but foreign policy experts have been mourning the lost leader and pointing to the dangers and uncertainties ahead.
President Sadat has been the strongest voice for peace in the Middle East, something I said 6 years ago, which was doubted considerably. No one doubts it now. He has been a noble man, one of the greatest men I've ever known in my life.
I think for us it will require a new look at our Middle East policy and a greater sense of urgency than would have been the case when we could rely on some local leadership. It is not trivial for our national security, to put it mildly.
I think what's involved here in some fashion, in any case, is an attempt to destabilize not only Egypt itself, but the region, and particularly the moderate Arab states. Egypt is the linchpin of a secure belt of moderate Arab states involving, in addition to Egypt, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and so forth. If President Sadat were to be removed from the picture, the Camp David process would come probably to a standstill, at least for a while, and there would be a period of severe instability in the Arab world. And thus, at stake are really very major strategic considerations.
So, where does all this leave the Middle East in general? Here's our diplomatic correspondent, Christopher Wayne.
President Sadat's death means the keystone of American foreign policy in the Middle East has gone. In the resulting confusion, it seems quite possible that the Israelis won't be prepared to complete their withdrawal from occupied Sinai next April. The hawks in Israel will doubtless argue that the pledge of peace was a personal one given by Sadat, and their fears will make them want to hang on to what they've got. So today's shooting has sown the seeds of yet another conflict. That in turn will make American relations more difficult with the other vital Arab nation, Saudi Arabia. American plans to sell top-secret airborne warning and control radar planes, known as AWACS, to the Saudis were already in trouble. The Israeli government had been claiming the sale would endanger her security, although the Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, has been trying to persuade the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the sale must go through.
Without question, we will continue to have far-reaching common interest with Saudi Arabia, even if this sale is defeated. It would be irresponsible for me to utter prophecies of doom, prophecies that could all too easily become self-fulfilling. But make no mistake, it would be irresponsible in the extreme to succumb to illusions about the real alternatives facing us today.
But with Sadat dead and his successor likely to take a more pro-Arab line, will the Americans now want to go ahead with this sale even if it's agreed by Congress? And will the Saudis want to get any closer to the United States, bearing in mind what happened to President Sadat? Diplomatic sources in London are convinced it was Sadat's pro-American line which provoked this attack. Last autumn, there were persistent rumors in Western intelligence circles that there was growing disaffection within the Egyptian army. The choice of the time and place of this attack indicates beyond doubt that the plot was hatched by the military. We don't know yet if the plotters died in the attack, or were they planning what to do during the confusion? The confusion is the key word.
So, in the space of a few seconds, in a stadium outside Cairo, President Sadat, bold, decisive, arrogant, and perhaps a little foolhardy, was mortally wounded. And with his death, American policy in the Middle East, and whatever life still remains in the Camp David agreement, looks like being snuffed out too. President Sadat gambled by throwing out the Russians in 1972 and turning to the West. That more or less came off. And then he gambled on a peace with Israel, on the assumption that the Israelis would match the boldness and the generosity of his gesture. That didn't come off. It all got bogged down. And nothing afterwards, not even the Camp David conference itself, ever quite matched that moment in November 1977 when Sadat arrived in Jerusalem. It was one of the key events of our time, and it was also the first step in the process which led today to his death in Cairo. And now for the rest of the news. In Northern Ireland, 3 days after the end of the hunger strikes at the Maze prison, the Northern Ireland Secretary, James Pryor, has revealed his promised prison reforms. John Humphreys has been following the day's events there. He reports now from Belfast.
The government had to do something about the Maze prison. If they didn't, the hunger strike or some other form of protest might have started all over again. Their problem was to give the prisoners just enough to satisfy them and enable the IRA to save face, but at the same time not to concede so much that the Protestant extremists would make it unworkable. Well, by tonight it looks as if Mr. Pryor may have succeeded in doing just that. Here's what the prisoners wanted, the so-called 5 demands. They wanted to wear their own clothes, and they can. They wanted to be able to move around freely with each other, and they've won some concessions here too. They wanted to win back remission of sentences lost for bad behavior, and they've got half that, so about 25 will now be set free before Christmas. They wanted to be excused compulsory prison work, and that's not being conceded, but it may be reviewed later. As for more visits and parcels, they'll get that if they behave. What they've not got, says Mr. Pryor, is political or special status of any kind. And it's true that these reforms will apply to every prisoner in Northern Ireland and not just the IRA men. On the other hand, the reforms have been introduced now because of the pressures the hunger strike brought on the government here and from abroad. Mr. Pryor's hoping today's moves will cool the temperature and take the pressure off.
Now, there's no doubt about it that the hunger strike has proved extremely divisive. It has polarized society here. Now, I hope that as a result of the action that we have taken following the ending of the hunger strike, that this will now help to bring people closer together again.
Mrs. Thatcher once described the hunger strike as the IRA's last card. Do you see it that way? Where do you think they now go from here specifically?
Well, if they have any sense and if they have any understanding, they will seek the path of cooperation, as I hope others will too. But I must warn everyone that the campaign to root out terrorism will be an unremitting campaign. And I'm determined, as are all the forces of Northern Ireland, to see that the campaign continues with great vigor so that we get terrorism stamped out of society as quickly and in any way we can.
Do you hope then that this may be some kind of turning point in Northern Ireland?
I think that's too early to say. What I believe is we're doing what is right and what is just, and we shall expect to be regarded in that light.
The men in the maze will soon be visited by one of Mr. Pryor's ministers to try and persuade them of that. And there is some confidence now that prisoners still staging the so-called blanket protest will go back to dressing normally. Mrs. Anne Gildernew has 2 sons in jail who are on the blanket, and after visiting them today, she said there is a new atmosphere there.
Well, everybody today in there was like going into a holiday camp. Everybody seemed very happy. There was a different air about the place altogether, you know, I thought.
So they were generally a lot happier?
I didn't notice any difference in the prisoners now. But the general air of everything seemed to be, you know, something finished or something achieved, if you like.
The government's always claimed that conditions in the maze are of the highest standard, but behind the hunger strike, which led to 10 deaths and the other protests, is the IRA's insistence that they are political prisoners and should not be treated as ordinary criminals. Sinn Féin were claiming today that their case had been strengthened by the government's concession on prisoners' clothing.
You look at the question of clothes. The British government in September 1976 said that captured Republican prisoners would have to wear a British criminal uniform. And for 5 years they tried to beat the prisoners into wearing that uniform. And for 5 years the prisoners refused and then went on hunger strike. And the uniform symbolised British criminalisation, and that has been overturned. And despite the British government saying for 5 years that the prisoners would have to wear a uniform, now the prisoners, as of right, are allowed to wear their own clothes.
Well, one of the Protestant leaders, Ian Paisley, is predictably angry. He said all along there should be no concessions to the prisoners, and he's condemned Mr. Pryor's initiative as a sellout and a betrayal of the Protestant people.
Well, of course, his statement is a whitewash.
and let us spell it out very strongly and clearly. We have not capital punishment as a deterrent to terrorism.
Well, one of the Protestant leaders, Ian Paisley, is predictably angry. He said all along there should be no concessions to the prisoners, and he's condemned Mr. Pryor's initiative as a sellout and a betrayal of the Protestant people.
Well, of course, his statement is a whitewash, and let us spell it out very strongly and clearly. We have not capital punishment as a deterrent to terrorism. We have only one thing, and that is imprisonment. Now the imprisonment of terrorists is going to be completely and almost totally feather-bedded. What I'd like to see Mr. Pryor saying, look, until there is a ceasefire, I am not going to give any concessions of any kind. The government has told us that it was the best prison in the whole of the world. Now they say in the spirit of reconciliation we're going to give in. So they've given in, and they have won the war and lost the peace.
The effect of the hunger strike was to give the IRA a significant boost in morale and resources at a time when they needed it badly. If Mr. Pryor wins peace in the Maze prison, despite what Mr. Paisley says, he'll see it as a particularly encouraging start to one of the most difficult jobs in British politics.
John Humphreys reporting from Belfast. Shirley Williams is to be the Social Democrats' candidate at the Crosby by-election, up to now a rock-hard Conservative seat. She was formally invited to stand tonight by the local SDP chairman after making a surprise announcement to her party conference in Bradford that she was willing to take up the challenge. The Liberal candidate at Crosby, selected only a few days ago, has agreed to stand down. Mrs. Williams' offer to go into battle was greeted with wild enthusiasm by the conference.
We have in this party to scale unscalable heights. We have to take impossible risks. There is, as you know, at the present time, a by-election called in Crosby where the Conservative majority is 19,672. I want to make it clear, though I shall say no more about it at this stage, that if I'm invited to serve as the candidate for Crosby, nothing would give me greater satisfaction.
The SDP leaders say they're confident they can win this seat with Shirley Williams, making the party's first impact in Conservative territory. And another Labour MP has gone over to the Social Democrats, David Ginsburg, member for Dewsbury for the past 22 years. He said he couldn't support the left-wing policies approved at the Brighton conference. But MP Tom McNally, a former advisor to Mr Callaghan, is still making up his mind about joining them. He's certainly leaving the Labour Party. Opponents of Mrs Thatcher inside the Conservative Party have begun to launch their strongest challenge to her policies, though it still isn't clear whether there's any kind of coordination about what they're doing. Today, the most important of her critics, her predecessor, Mr Edward Heath, called on the Conservative Party to abandon Mrs Thatcher's policies and return to the consensus politics of his government. Speaking to the Federation of Conservative Students in Manchester, Mr Heath said that with the country locked into a vicious economic spiral, the time had come to speak out. Gary Lloyd asked him if he were giving the Prime Minister a fair chance.
Well, I'm putting forward constructive proposals. The fair chance is for people to examine them seriously, but it does show there is another way.
How much support have you got in the Conservative Party?
I don't know. I'm putting forward these proposals on my own.
It's said that between 70 and 90 MPs may share your views. Do you think that's true?
I don't know at all. I have no idea.
Are you leading a rebellion against the Prime Minister of the so-called Wets?
I've never heard such nonsense in my life. Who have I got to lead anyhow? What I'm doing is putting forward proposals, and I'm doing it not only in the economic sphere, but in the later course of this week, I'm going to deal with international relations, how we try to get a better relationship between the industrial and developing countries. I'm doing it in social policy, which I've always talked and written about, which I think is terribly important. And I'm doing in more detail what I think the European community ought now to do with its policies in order to cope with the present world situation. Well, these are all an attempt to be constructive.
Aren't you being singularly disloyal to Mrs Thatcher and her party?
Let us forget all about this. The Conservative Party hitherto has been a party which has always discussed policy openly. It's also been a party which has never been addicted to dogma and to say there is only one particular solution, because we all know there are lots of ways of handling questions in politics and in economics. And there can be no question of people of trying to prevent discussion by saying it's disloyal to mention this. Anyhow, one also has loyalties to other people. One has loyalties to one's constituents who are suffering, and one has loyalties to one's country as well as that. And I believe one should look at all of those.
Edward Heath. Well, Mrs. Thatcher's defended her government's policies in what's seen as a strong attack on the ones proposed by Mr. Heath. Departing from a prepared speech to students at a Melbourne university, the Prime Minister said she counted herself among those politicians who operate from conviction. Pragmatism wasn't enough, she said, nor was the fashionable word consensus. On her arrival at the university, Mrs. Thatcher also faced a demonstration against her Northern Ireland policy. Keith Graves reports.
It was, said its organisers, to be a massive demonstration against Mrs. Thatcher and in support of the IRA. And as Monash University has a turbulent record for student protest, 500 policemen and a score of horses were in attendance. In the event, it was a desultory affair with police almost outnumbering demonstrators. A protest that will best be remembered not for the cause it espoused, but for the somewhat dramatic arrival of its object. It was also unusual in that Mrs. Thatcher travelled wedged between two men, her husband and the head of her special branch bodyguard. She must have heard the protesters, but she gave them no acknowledgement. 6 armed security men shielded the Prime Minister and Mr. Thatcher from the demonstrators' view. Mrs. Thatcher had altered her speech at the last minute to include a reference to consensus politics.
To me, consensus seems to be the process of abandoning all beliefs, principles, values, and policies in search of something in which no one believes, but to which no one objects. It is the process of avoiding the very issues that have to be solved, merely because you can't get agreement on the way ahead. What great cause could have been fought and won under the banner, "I stand for consensus"?
Mrs. Thatcher's counterblast there to Mr. Heath. The miners have had their pay claim turned down. Their union wanted 23%. The National Coal Board has offered roughly 9%. The board says this is all that's available, about £71 million out of a total of £120 million for the whole industry. There's a lot of football tonight, 19 games in the first leg of the second round of the League Cup. We'll be bringing you the scores in full at about 5 to 10 on BBC1. And that's the news tonight, a night in which one story overrides all others. President Anwar Sadat of Egypt has been murdered. He was shot by a group of his own soldiers while he was reviewing Egypt's annual parade. His defence minister was among others who died. A special programme on President Sadat and the Middle East will be following on BBC1 in a few moments. From me, good night.